Perfect. Well, welcome everyone who's here right now. Hopefully some more people will join as we get started. Candice and I are here representing the Unscientific Method, and we have Kaylee and Michael here from SciCats. And this is a 3-part workshop series that we're really excited to get going with. Kaylee and Michael will be running the first 2 sessions, which will be online, and then this will be followed by a 3rd session in person at UBC campus that we're really excited for everyone to join us for. And in this last session, we'll be working to publish an article to be published on the Advice to a Scientist page, which Candice is going to post a link in the chat. So hopefully you can go check out their website. It's a super cool platform where researchers can share their experiences and hopefully guide peers and younger generations through some of the struggles that they've gone through. Just to link this all back to what we're doing here, we are part of a new podcast initiative at UBC campus and hopefully beyond UBC, where we interview young scientists and get to know a little bit more about their research. And really important, we'll be recruiting from participants that have gone through all 3 sessions of this workshop series. And those participants will then get a one-on-one session with SciCats before being interviewed on the podcast. So super excited for this session. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Michael.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Laura. Good morning, everyone. I'm Michael and Kaylee. We're both from SciCats, and we're both coming to you from a beautiful day here on the unceded territory, the Musqueam, Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh. And drop into the chat. This is, like Laura said, a podcasting. We're going to help you with your science communication skills with a focus on podcasting, although a lot of the skills are general in all sorts of communication. Throw into the chat your name. Did you do Wordle this morning? How many tries did you get? Did you get it? Do you do Wordle?
I still don't know. I still don't know how it works. And I refuse to look it up. I refuse. So I've been trying to infer how it works by watching Twitter. I think I maybe know, but it's a mystery.
Yeah. Okay. Well, if you don't play Wordle, then throw into the chat what your favorite podcast is, because of course that is also good to know. Good to know if we're all listening to podcasts, we know what a podcast is. You know, I don't think my mom knows what a podcast is. I keep telling her that I have a podcast. She's like, "What is that? How do I get it?" I don't know. You know, but she knows how to find YouTube. So I don't know how she can do that, but not find a podcast. Let me start sharing my screen here. Everyone see that okay?
Yeah.
All right. So like if you have met us before, Kaylee and I, we're both science communicators. We come from different fields. I work at the H.R. MacMillan Space Center. I deal in space. Kaylee is a rat scientist. And we're going to get into how that applies to how we tell our stories and how we use our stories and use the things that we love and are passionate about in our science communication. That is all how you, as a potential interviewee or interviewer, how you should approach some of this work. It makes it fun, and podcasting should be fun, and hopefully everyone here is coming with that mindset, because I know Kaylee and I, we both love it. We have our own podcast as well called Nerding About, which spun off from a live event we used to do called Nerd Night, but we're both also dabbling in other fields as well. We're going to be talking about some of those other things that we do, and of course SciCats is all about training you. We do a bunch of different kinds of workshops. Maybe you've been to one of our workshops. We did some workshops in December with the Unscientific Method folks in I guess like almost a month ago. So we're going to be reviewing some of that stuff. And if you were at those workshops, it's going to be a bit of a review. If you didn't go to those workshops, we'll walk you through some of the methods that we are going to lay out about honing your message, which is what we're trying to do here. So today we're going to step through a few things. Kaylee and I both have experience in dealing with the media. So, podcasting is like the framework of what we're talking about, but it is also helping you when you get, somebody reaches out to you and they want to talk to you on the radio, which is basically just like the formal podcasting world. Like radio and podcasting is the same, whether it's a a news reporter coming to talk to you. All of these techniques we're going to step through. So media interviews, we're going to talk about mission statements, we're going to help you build a narrative, and we're going to practice building your narrative, because that's really what it comes down to. If you're here in this workshop, that means that you're committed, and we are thankful that you're here. That shows that you want to build your science communication skills, and that's great. Practice is how you're going to get better. I certainly was not good at it when I first started. I was very nervous and very fumbly, but you get better at it. And I definitely work with people at the Space Center where I work. Everyone is always so nervous. I remember the first time I left, I think it was like July 2019, and it was the 50th anniversary of the Apollo mission. We were basically getting like a million calls all the time. And I was like, I'm going on vacation. We just hired a new astronomer, and it was like her first week on the job. And she had to go on to CBC that morning. And she was like, calling me, she's like, I'm going to puke. I'm like, you're going to be great. And she was great. you just got to practice. So that's why we're here. We're going to help you practice. So let's talk about different kinds of media. It seems pretty basic. You got your TV, you got your radio. People even know what radio is anymore, but podcasting really is, the modern radio. And when the podcast that Kaylee and I run is an independent podcast, meaning there's not a producer. We're our own producer. We get to control our content. But when you have the CBC, of course, that is a very large corporation. And it's good to keep in mind that when you're getting reached out from some of these larger companies, that the types of messaging that you're going to be using is going to be altered. Okay, so TV, radio, print media, thinking about who is reaching out to you, where are they coming from, is all very important. So when you're about to get that call, and maybe get a call, you want to start doing your homework and start thinking about those questions that I just laid out. Who is the audience for the show? CBC, very broad. Nerding About, Kaylee and Michael, we have our own nerdy little audience. What's the tone of the show? What's the mission statement of the show? How do you do these things? Well, certainly you're going to want to listen to a bunch of episodes. So if somebody on a podcast reaches out to you, definitely listen to a couple episodes before you even answer, because maybe you are not appropriate for that show. Maybe you'd be like, I'm not sure if I'm the right person, but I do know somebody that is. And that's also a really helpful thing that they will be very appreciative of, because when you do start to get reached out by these producers or people that want to be on your show, it's really the start of you building a relationship and hopefully starting to build your career. And so if you know that you're not appropriate for a certain show, but perhaps there's an opportunity down the road, those are all sort of like starting to build the relationships they're going to build with the media and with these producers. I still get calls from people, from producers, that even when they change shows, just because they know me and they kind of like know what I do, and they trust that that the message that I'm going to give is going to be appropriate for their show. So that last thing that I have on there is the mission statement of the show. And that's what I want to sort of like focus in on right now, because that's going to help you understand your audience. And a mission statement, I first started learning about that when I went to business school, but it really applies to everything. Maybe people don't call it a mission statement. Maybe people just call it a description. I use the term mission statement. It's what we use at my work at the H.R. McMillan Space Center. We're a nonprofit society. It's kind of the business lingo, but you can apply it to really anything. So let's step through some classic shows, which maybe you have listened to, and we can think about the different kinds of mission statements, and also think about the audience. Okay, so Quirks and Quarks. How many people have listened to Bob McDonald, Quirks and Quarks? I've been listening to it almost my whole life. Very classic show, still one of my favorites. And I went to the website, and right there, we got a description, which is we're going to use as the mission statement, covers the quirks of the expanding universe to the quarks within a single atom and everything in between. I think that is the definition of general science. Wouldn't you say so, Kaylee?
Could not be more general. Yeah. Agreed.
Exactly. So they are covering the whole gamut. But when you listen to Quirks and Quarks, you know that it is very results based. They are talking about the research. They are looking for the impacts of that research. It is very science focused, and it's short. Like each interview that Bob McDonald does is about 8 minutes. So it is very honed on your research. What's the impacts of that research? How does that research affect the general public? CBC has that not just Canada-wide audience now, because of the podcasting world. Podcasting is worldwide. So Quirks and Quarks actually has a worldwide audience. So it does have that Canada focus because it's CBC and they have to have, so many Canadian scientists on the show, but it does have an international focus as well. Let's Innovate. This is my other podcast that I do. Very similar format to Quirks and Quarks in that it's only 8 to 15 minutes. But as you can see, the mission statement, telling the stories of science fair participants to find out where their passions lie. So almost the opposite to Quirks and Quarks. So instead of results-based, now we're looking at the stories behind the young scientists. As an interviewer, I should say, I'm looking for where the inspiration came before the young scientists started to do their work. I'm trying to sort of extract those stories, get some inspiration for future science fair participants, even for people that aren't involved in science fairs. It's inspirational to hear stories of young scientists. And also in the current season of Let's Innovate, I'm actually going through the alumni and seeing where the alumni have ended up, where they're at with their careers. But I'm looking for those good stories to tell beyond the science. A little bit about the research, but not much. It's really about inspiration. The focus of these workshops, of course, is the unscientific method, which hopefully everyone has listened to. It's a wonderful podcast. And as we can see here, their mission statement, unpacking the research of lives of young scientists doing amazing things all around us. So it's a little bit of both. If you listen to the podcast, they talk to one scientist, they talk about their research, they talk about their impact, with the general public, just like Quirks and Quarks does with Bob McDonald, but they're also looking for those stories as well that I'm extracting. So the episode is a little bit longer. So the unscientific method is usually about a 20 to 30 minute podcast where they do both. They kind of divide it up. Sometimes they mishmash, they go into the research, sometimes they go into the stories. And in all three of these podcasts, we all go through a method where you have a pre-interview and we sort of set up where the story is going to go. And as an interviewer, you kind of have a general picture of where you're going to go. And then you just get into it. And we do this at Nerd and About, which is a very similar format to the unscientific method. We also talk about the results of a scientist, but we're not always talking to scientists. We're also looking for those stories, the inspiration behind the scientist. And the other thing I just want to mention too, in all of these shows is tone. So Quirks and Quarks, very formal tone. It's a Canadian Broadcast Corporation. You're probably not going to swear. You come on to Nerd and About with me and Kaylee, it's okay to swear. We actually encourage it because we're trying to break down some of that stigma. And it's good to have both. It's good to have a show like Quirks and Quarks that's out there that is very formal and very science-based results. And it's also, I think, nice to have shows like the Unscientific Method and Nerd and About, where scientists get to have fun and be themselves, be real human beings.
Michael, I would add that later we're going to be talking a little bit about story and character and how you bring these things in and talk about your science. And so really looking at 3 podcasts that have somewhat similar missions, but a different approach to it, from being very much about the research to very much about the person, helps you to think about how you're going to craft your story or what you're going to talk about, and helps you prepare for the kinds of questions that you're going to get asked. If I go on Quirks and Quarks, I know that I'm probably not going to get asked about my inspiration or what I like doing in my spare time. But if I'm on, say, Let's Innovate, I'm going to be getting questions about much more about who I am. And so that also helps you determine whether or not A, you want to be on that podcast, and B, what you're going to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. Like all of this stuff that we're talking about right now is homework. This is the homework that you're doing. You're gathering information so that you're prepared. If we continue on with the mission statements, we've flipped around to if you as the interviewer. So not everyone is going to be in this boat, but so we're going to think about what it might be like if you were the interviewer. So for me, I like to think about the organizations that I may be representing. Okay, so if you work for UBC, perhaps UBC is part of that. If you are interviewing as in a formal capacity for organization, it's important to remember that they have a mission as well, right? So when I'm interviewing somebody through the H.R. MacMillan Space Center, I want to remind myself, what is our mission of our organization? And this is not something that I might be fusing specifically in the interview, but it's the homework that the approach that I'm taking. And it's also, I think, a really good exercise to do on a regular basis because these get updated. And as an organization, the H.R. MacMillan Space Center, we update this mission statement, on a pretty regular basis. So I actually just looked it up recently, and I was like surprised, like, oh yeah, we updated this actually like last year, using the universal appeal of science of space as a cultural bridge to bring people together to activate curiosity, creativity, and community. And that just reminds me, like, oh yeah, that's actually what we're supposed to be doing. And you don't see anything really in there about, highlighting research, which some people think that we do, but really we are that bridge to like bringing the science and bringing the inspiration of all of the people that work in the universe, which right now we're actually expanding that scope. It's not just people in the physics and astronomy department. If you look at our programming plan, we have brought in people from the whole gamut of science, using the universe as this window into all sorts of different sciences. So that's what I bring. I have that understanding that I represent this organization. That's going to help me approach how I bring some questions into that field. Now, you can also do this personally. I do this recently. My friend Kim Sumkamp Carvey gave me this inspiration to draft a personal mission statement. It's not something that everyone does, but I've started to do it in my practice because I have things that I'm passionate about. And I have things that through my work, I want to advocate for. And this may be very personal. It may be something that you may not address directly, but for you individually, it is important for you to have that foundation of, here I am as a scientist, this is what I believe in, this is what I'm going to be advocating for. And so your personal mission statement may be very personal to you and may not even be something that you share, but it's something that you keep for yourself. And it's also something you can update on a regular basis. I do this on a regular basis. I go back to it and sometimes I tinker with the wording of it. And it's something that gives me my foundation, my bedrock, if you will. So why don't you just take a minute and grab a pen and draft a personal mission statement for yourself.
Just quickly too, to link this back to podcasting, like Michael was saying, this is something that you might not share on a podcast, right? You might not come out and say, by the way, my mission statement is X. Yeah. But if you have an idea of what your mission statement is, it also helps you think about the story you're going to tell. So for me as a scientist, one of the things that I'm really passionate about and would say is a real key part of my own mission statement is that I'm interested in finding solutions to problems that improve the health of people, animals, and the environment. I really want to like health for everybody. And so when I'm thinking about how I'm going to tell a story, I'm thinking about how I'm going to share information that's relevant to everyone. And that is like a holistic look at health. And so that's how I approach interviews and the answers to questions. So doing a brief write down of whatever your mission statement might be related to yourself and related to your work can help share, or it can help dictate how you're going to share your story in a podcast interview.
And the other thing that this does as well is this helps you stand out as someone who could potentially be a regular on with the media. They're going to come back to you and they're going to be like, hey, this person, this brain researcher, there's 20, 30, 40 of them I could potentially interview, but this particular brain researcher has a really interesting outlook and they bring a really interesting perspective. And that perspective fits in with the show, or maybe the producers really like the unique perspectives that they bring. So really kind of like helping hone your personal mission statement can help you stand out as a potential person that people want to interview. And for me, I advocate for bridging that gap between scientists and non-scientists. And lots of my friends that aren't scientists, that don't understand science, I have that thought that I want to help them understand the science, and I want to help break down those barriers between the academic institutions, the non-formal learning institutions, and just regular everyday people. That's something that I personally like to advocate for. So hopefully everyone's had a little chance to start to write down some notes. That'll be your homework. We're going to be giving you a few pieces of homework. Hopefully everyone takes that to heart. But we're going to continue on with our preparation, because our preparation is not done yet. There is never too much preparation that you can do as you're preparing for these interviews. So let's get into sort of like a pre-interview situation, and start to think about what could potentially happen. And I think if all of the anxiety that happens in these situations, especially when you first start, is just the unknown. So start to anticipate the questions you might get asked. And you can look at your science. You can look at, was there a specific news story? Is there a specific reason why someone is reaching out to you? Or is it just your general department or something that you're focused on? So you can start there, but also potentially your own story that you can help shape, right? So if you know your story and you know your mission statements that you have laid down as your foundation, you can start to help shape all of that narrative that's going to happen. And the pre-interview is the norm in the industry. It doesn't always happen, like in a very non-formal podcast like Kaylee and I, like we don't go through a formal pre-interview process, but we do sort of vet. We have casual conversations here and there because we want the tone to be unplanned, if you will. That's really kind of like the tone of the podcast, is kind of to be loose and to be go off on weird tangents. But with a podcast like Quirks and Quarks, certainly that pre-interview process, couldn't be long. It might even be like an hour podcast. I've had pre-interviews that have gone on for, seem like forever. And then the actual interview is 2 minutes long. But you can't over prepare. There's no such thing as over preparing. You have all of that background that you're ready for. And it's so much easier to take things out rather than adding in the last minute. Is just really the way to go. So Kaylee, both of us have been in this situation, pre-interviews. What are some of the stories that have come out of the pre-interviews that you've had in your experience?
Yeah, that's a good question. I know that pre-interviews tend to be a little standard. I'd say I've done a lot of media interviews and a few podcasts, and I'd say pre-interviews have maybe been like in 10 to 25% of them, but they're usually get a pre-interview if it's part of a broader story. Like I did a couple pre-interviews actually with the CBC for their Ideas podcast. So there's a 2-part series on rats, and we did quite a few pre-interviews for that. And Ideas is a podcast that brings together lots of different perspectives and scientists and non-scientists to talk about an issue. And so they're really trying to find the overarching story that brings everybody together, right? So it's important for them to know in advance who they're going to bring in, what perspective they're going to bring in, and all that kind of stuff. So I'd say Ideas is one example. of one of those broader stories where there was a pre-interview, but usually they're to explore the story and whose voice is going to be included in it. Go ahead.
Yeah, and that pre-interview is also a great opportunity for you to try to understand what are they interested in telling. They might have something that they're trying to get at, and they may not tell you. You know, they may have like a little bit of an idea, but they're not going to tell you that because they really want to hear what you have to bring, which is where they're going to probe with some questions. Where is this science going? What is the impact of this science? What are the things that they don't know? They're going to probe your knowledge about certain things. And maybe they're going to shape the interview in certain directions. Maybe they won't. They're really trying to make some decisions, because after the interview, and if we're talking about in those larger shows where there's more than one producer, the person that you're talking to is not going to make the final decision. They're going to go back to their producer. They're going to go back to the host, and they're really going to make a game plan so that when they do call you, they've got all of these options. And as they're talking to you, they're going to go in different directions. But this is also, that pre-interview is also the opportunity for you to shape the story you're going to tell. So for me, over the past couple of years, I've noticed that I've been getting a lot of interview requests that want to talk about Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, a lot of these billionaires that are going up into space. You know, this is my topic. This is the realm that I am drawn into. So I don't really want to tell their story. I will use what's happening, this news story of SpaceX and Blue Origin as perhaps a jumping off point to talk about some bigger issues, because that's my personal opportunity to talk about the real things that I want to talk about, which is perhaps why humans are going up into space in the first place. Are there other ways that we can use these conversations to talk about the problems here on Earth? You know, that's what I'm trying to bring. And maybe that's not where the interview is going to go, but I'm going to use the pre-interview to kind of like establish, hey, there's some really interesting topics here that we can kind of side tangent off of, perhaps talking about Elon Musk going up into space. And that's,
I would say
all that work has to be done in the pre-interview. Sorry,
you can jump in there too and say, like, if it looks like this interview is going somewhere that you're not interested in, you can say, this is where you can say, I'm not the right person for this. When COVID started, I got so many requests asking me to talk about rats and COVID, and there was zero data on it. Everything was really new. And that's all anybody wanted to talk about. And I'd be like, well, actually, here's all the things that we do know about rats and disease things. But if you want to talk specifically about COVID, I'm not your person for that. And you should know that there's no data. And please don't talk to somebody who tells you there is data. But that is a place where you can have those conversations. And then sometimes those stories do end up changing. So other important parts here around navigating that pre-interview is, like Michael was saying at the beginning, is to anticipate questions. If you're in grad school, you are probably already thinking about all the questions you get asked from an academic standpoint for things like comprehensive exams. But you can do the same thing for an interview. It's usually people care about what, why, and how. Those kinds of questions often come up. And it's a good place to help the reporter help you. If there's a story you want to tell and there's sources that you think are relevant to them to tell that story, you can direct them there. If there's other folks that you think they should talk to, you can direct them there. One thing that I think is really important too is that if someone asks you a question that's off topic, one of the greatest skills as a communicator, whether it be on a podcast, radio, TV, whatever, is improvisation and trying to find a bridge. And actually, I have had it on my to-do list for years to take improvisation classes or improvisation classes for this very reason. I know that Michael's done a lot of improvisation, but it's really helpful because you can answer a question and you can spin it, right? You can say, oh yeah, that's an interesting question, but actually, with the really interesting thing is actually over here. And that's how you can divert to what it is you want to talk about. And if you're concerned at all about where this interview is going to go, you're very welcome to ask for a pre-interview or even just to go back and forth by email with the folks who are interested on having you on the podcast to figure out what their interests are. So those are some things you can do for the pre-interview. Number one suggestion is when you're thinking about preparing for questions for a podcast, I don't know if the Unscientific Method already has this one on their list, is to prepare for, is there anything else you want to tell me? This 95% of times gets asked at the end of an interview, usually, especially a formal interview with like a news broadcaster. And I teach a course in risk communication, and I tell people to prepare for this question, and I never prepare for it myself. And I'm always mortified when it comes up. I'm like, oh, right. So this is something that I highly recommend, or we highly recommend, that you prepare for. It's one question you can automatically write down and know that you're probably going to get. So let's talk a little bit now. So we've talked about interviews. Having a mission statement is really important because it guides the story that you're going to tell. And we've already done some science storytelling in the first two parts of this workshop. So we're really not going to go too much into this and have you do the same thing that you did previously, but we're going to build a bit in terms of how to prepare for your interview. So something we've talked about before is, how do you find your narrative? Podcast interviews, any kind of interviews, are about telling a story. That can be in a 30-minute interview. It can be in a 1-minute interview, but having some kind of central story is really important because it helps you share your science clearly and in an engaging way with your audience. And we've introduced through these workshops before a framework called the And But Therefore framework, which is a storytelling framework that was introduced by Randy Olson, who does a lot of science communication writing, has a book called Stop Being Such a Scientist or Don't Be Such a Scientist, all about how to engage your audience and tell stories. And what Randy talks about in this book is actually this, framework for storytelling is incredibly compelling, but that scientists rarely use it, but that it's used frequently by the ABT actually came from inspiration from South Park. So South Park took all these and storylines and put some buts and therefores in them to give a more powerful narrative. And we're going to show you what that ABT looks like on the next slide. So this might be your typical storytelling framework. And this might be something that you would say in a podcast. Someone would ask you a question. You'd say, well, this happened, and then this happened, and then that happened, and then this happened, and on and on and on. It never really ends. And it doesn't really have sort of a top point or a resolution. But a compelling story always has a problem that you're trying to solve and a resolution. So the and, but, therefore takes some of these ands, takes them out, puts a but and a therefore in there. So you might have something happened and then something else, but here's the problem you're going to solve. Therefore, this is the resolution. And we do this in our science, right? The and is the background to what it is you're researching. The but is the problem you're trying to solve. Your therefore might be your hypothesis or the way that you go about solving your problem. So you are working in a space of and, but, therefore all the time. You just have to find that narrative in order to tell it. So here's an example from just basic storytelling. This is The Wizard of Oz. There's a girl in Kansas and things are pretty boring, but there's this tornado to Oz. And therefore this person has journey and growth. That's just an ABT. The Wizard of Oz could have been much more boring if there was no tornado and Dorothy just ran around continuously in Kansas doing not much of anything. But this incredible thing happened and there was this transformation and growth. So this is an example of an ABT that you would see, say, in film. And there's more to storytelling than that. So in our last workshop, we had you draft an ABT, but we also talked about other components of narrative. And this is an example from a story that I did with Nautilus, or a writer for Nautilus. And actually, as Michael was saying, it can be really important to build relationships with the folks who are doing the storytelling in media. This is someone who's come back to me a couple times to ask questions about other stories. So this was about some research that I did back in 2016, where we were looking at what happens when you go into a city block and you do pest control on rats. That's something we do all the time. We go into city blocks, we kill rats, we put down poison. Not anymore though, because rodenticides are banned in BC for at least the next year. But that's something that we do. And what impact does that have on the rats and their health? And so this person came with us in the field and wrote this story. And there were a number of storytelling components that were a part of this. Next, Michael. So here are some key storytelling components beyond the ABT. So you get your narrative, the and, but, therefore, that's the story arc you'll use when you're talking about your research. And then there's all these other things you can have in your story. So there's the setting. So in my research, I was studying rats in the downtown east side of Vancouver, and I had purchased a van to do my laboratory work, the rat van, the Ratmobile. So that's the setting. The characters are me, someone else who was doing the work with me, Michael Lee, and the rats. Those are all characters that are in my story. There's a plot. That plot is that ABT, the but, therefore, disturbing rats could actually increase disease. That's like the big climax of the story. And the moral is thinking about what is the big takeaway from this work. Well, the main thing that I would want to get through to folks in my interview is that actually we should be reconsidering how we currently manage rats. So if the things that we're doing now aren't working or they're making things worse, then we need to reconsider what we've been doing all along. So you've got your ABT, which is your narrative structure, and then you've got all these other components of your story: setting, characters, plot, and moral.
I love how the rat van is also a setting, but it ends up being also a character too. So
totally.
If we go back and think about the different podcasts, the rat van is probably not something you're going to talk about in Quirks and Quarks, but you're probably going to talk about the rat van in Let's Innovate, because there was a lot of inspiration. There's a lot of stories that came out of the rat van. And as a researcher, getting the story behind the researchers that are in this rat van, it becomes its own character in itself, and a really great place that you can start to tell some of those stories through.
Yeah. If you want to talk about journey and growth, the rat van had it for sure. But all elements, so all those elements, the characters, the setting, the plot, the moral, all of them should be linked to your message, which is your ABT. So if you draft your and, but, therefore, and then you're thinking of your characters and your plot, and they don't relate to your ABT at all, it's time to go back to the drawing board and think about how those things are connected, because you want everything to be pretty streamlined when you're telling your story. And when we're thinking about narrative structures, we introduced you to the ABT, but there are many others. One that you'll see a lot is the hero's journey, where you have a character who's just sort of in their ordinary world. They have a call to action, they solve a problem, and the world is a better place afterwards. That is sort of a longer version of an ABT. But what I like about this, or what we like about the hero's journey, is that it often positions the person doing the science as one of the main characters in the story. And again, characters can be anything. They can be the rats, they can be the rat van, they can be the people doing the research. But I think as scientists, we often miss that we are characters in our own stories, and often this journey is the compelling piece of the science. And what we learn along the way is one part of it, but this can be its own important narrative.
Yeah, and just to bring the unscientific method back into this, one of my favorite episodes was episode 2, where they talked to a researcher that is visualizing COVID data. When they finally got into their backstory, we found out that when they were in high school, they didn't like science. They thought science was not for them. They were in mechanics. They were in doing shop courses. They got into a punk rock band and they toured around. And I was like, this is an incredible story. And then they were thrust into doing science because their mom got sick, and they were just started to get really interested in science more. And now they're out there, helping us get through this pandemic, visualizing data. And I found that story, that arc, was so compelling. And then I also had to dive into, the hardcore music that they released. Actually, some really good stuff. I'm kind of into hardcore, so this is a story made for me. I loved it. Definitely check out episode 2 on the Unscientific Method podcast.
But that's where too, right? Where you have the compelling character is how you sometimes connect people with the science. Like, everybody is different. Everybody has their own interests, experiences, backgrounds, and listening to people's personal stories can sometimes be the most compelling bridge to bring people into the science.
I just had to look it up. Visualizing COVID-19 with Diraj Manar. That was the one. And yeah, so just like I said, like creating that character is something that we do, that Kaylee and I both do. And I think, certainly when I first started doing this, I was a little hesitant to do this because in some respects, it's kind of a cliche, right? Like my story is in some respects, like really, basic. It's like, oh, young boy falls in love with Star Wars, starts looking up at the stars, and then gets all curious and finds his passion through science fiction. Like it seems like that's like everyone's story, but you take that story and you make it work for you, and it works for me because it's real. And I start to use that as my bedrock, as like, here's who I am. This is how I'm going to deliver all of my science. I may not use Star Wars as a frame of reference anymore, and I'm starting to actually learn that lesson. Kids don't actually know Star Wars references anymore. I have to have to use some new references now. But that doesn't matter. It's like I still love space through ideas, through science fiction ideas. And that's how I still bring my love about talking about space. And Kaylee does the same thing, right? You've already heard talk about the rat van and being that quirky, nerdy scientist. Also, kind of a cliche, quirky, nerdy scientist. Yeah. But that's who Kaylee is, and she makes it work for herself, and she makes that into that character. Make yourself into that character. So it's being brave, and for me, and I don't know, don't want to speak for Kaylee, but for me, it's kind of like getting over that hump to be brave to show yourself in that light and to make yourself into that character. It really kind of like helps you frame a narrative because you're putting yourself into that narrative as a character.
Yeah, and I want to get to the activity, so I'll make this really quick. But I think one thing that can be important too is being open to finding the character. Like you might not know what it is now, but I was in a CBC interview on TV, and the person asked, the interviewer said something about me spying on rats. I can't remember, like, oh, so you're like spying on them. And I was like, oh, I fully spy on them. I'm a rat detective. And that is now my Twitter thing. I use rat detective for everything. And that's something I definitely didn't think of before, but that became the character that I used in my science through that interview and through a little bit of an improvisation. And yeah, I think just being open to finding your character can be really powerful. So we would like you to try it. Just take a couple minutes and draft a story. And we are going to use this as a basis for next week. So next slide, Michael. What we'll have you do is draft a story, and you're going to share these with a partner. So we've created a Google Drive. I'm going to put it down here in the chat. If you could draft in a doc in that Google Drive, a couple of things. Next week, when we come in, we're going to share stories. We'll partner you up, and we're going to have you read through each other's stories and actually do some of this podcast interview or interviewee stuff next. So just quickly, take 5 minutes and draft down some setting, characters, plot, moral, whatever comes to mind around a story that you might want to tell about your science. Place that in the drive, and it will, again, serve the basis of our work next week. You can flesh it out after this, but we'll give you a few minutes of quiet time to go through and draft that. If you have any questions about accessing the drive, let me know and I will troubleshoot it.
And just so you know, if you're thinking about making yourself into a character and worrying that it's not creative enough, when Kaylee and I first started doing the podcast, I just became Space Michael. And that is the most basic character that I could possibly be. But it works because it frames myself in that sense. Like you don't need to think about it like what kind of science am I into? Space Michael. That could be really basic. If you want to just like start building your character, it can be really simple as that. You just need a character.
I'm creating some docs in the drive if that's easier. Sometimes I'm spelling them wrong, and instead of story, I'm writing Sautry. But if you want to use one of those already created docs, you can do that if that's easier.
And of course, Kaylee, I've been doing a lot of talking. So if anyone has any questions about any of the stuff that we have gone through, feel free to throw something into the chat. If you have any questions. We've gone through a lot of stuff, gone through a lot of pre-interview for your interviews next week. We're really preparing you for next week, where we're going to be doing a lot of this work.
We'll give you another minute or two, and then we'll give you an example, and we'll go over prep for next week. So what we'll do is we'll share this link with the Unscientific Method, and maybe you can share that with the folks who are here today. And we'll put the instructions again in there, but you'll have time throughout the week to work on just a rough outline of your story. And this is going to serve the basis for some actual podcast interviewing next week. And so we thought we'd just give you a quick example of what this could look like. So this is an ABT about my research. So let's pretend that I've written my draft and Michael's going to be the person who's interviewing me next week. Similarly, Michael will have drafted a bit of a story. Space Michael will have drafted a story, and I will be reading Space Michael's story. So my ABT for the story that I want to tell is rats carry bacteria that can make people sick, and there are lots of rats in cities, but our current ways of managing rats aren't working. Therefore, we need to reconsider how we manage and live with rats in cities. And the characters you've already seen, they are the, next slide. Thank you. The settings, the downtown east side in the rat van. My characters are me and my research assistant, Michael Lee, and the rats. The plot is that disturbing rats can increase the number of rats carrying disease. And my moral is we need to do something different. And you'll see that all of these things are related back to my ABT. So let's say this is the amount of information that Michael gets. Maybe Michael gets an extra sentence or two, but this is about it. And so, Michael, as an interviewer, what questions might you have?
Well, thanks, Dr. Byers, for coming on to the Space Michael show.
Wow.
Question for you. As an everyday liver in this city, what's some advice that you can give to the everyday person that's going out and taking their trash out into those bins and seeing some rats? What's something that an everyday person can do to help the rat problem?
Yeah, thank you very much for your question. You know, that's actually an excellent question, because waste management is actually at the source of why we have rats in cities, or why we have the number of rats that we do. And so proper waste management is really key. And so you're already taking your waste out. That's excellent. But really what you need to be doing is looking to make sure that your waste bins are properly sealed, that you don't have any cracks in the side of your waste bins. And if you do, you should be considering calling the city, their 311 line, and they can let you know if they can bring by a new waste bin for you.
Well, that's really interesting.
Yeah, well, it's fine.
And then, of course, I was going to spin off, and there's lots of other things in there that I find really interesting. In my podcast, like everyday stuff. I really like hearing about the science stories. So I probably would have asked a question about the rat van. That seemed pretty cool. And thinking about what my show and what my listeners might be interested in. So then I would ask a question about the rat van. Tell me about the rat van. Tell me a story about the rat van.
Yeah. And so I'm not going to do that now because we only have a few minutes left, but it is a great question. And I think one thing too to note, right, is, so Michael asked me about managing waste, but maybe my mission is actually that I want people to call the 311 line, because ultimately the more people who call the 311 line, the more information we're going to have about rats in Vancouver, which is why I would pivot to, so if you see this thing, you should call the 311 line. That's part of my mission for this particular call. So having your mission statement outlined, your ABT, some of the characters will prepare you for an interview. And as Michael said, you really can't over prepare. We actually have a great working relationship with Jay Ingram, who originally was the host of Quirks and Quarks. And Jay told me once, you should, even if you're going to have a 10-15 minute interview, you should have done this, or you should have prepare for an hour. And then even if the story goes somewhere that you're not anticipating, you've prepared for many potential stories that could come out of that work. So having a bit of an over preparation is really key. So for your homework this week, go through, write a brief outline. Don't take too much work on it. Upload your story, and we will put you in groups next week to work on this. If you want to prepare, then have a think about what questions you might ask yourself and why based off the information you put there. And that might give a good idea of what you could be asked.
And the other thing that I will add to this, because homework I know can be a bit triggering for some of us as we're in the depths of, second month. It's a nice day out today, but have fun with this. This is really, for me, a big part of the fun stuff that I get to do in my everyday, getting to talk about fun stuff, because you get to shape that narrative. And so this work can be fun. If you allow yourself to be a bit silly, and you can be silly right now, and play, right? This is the practice and the fun that we get to have. And it's really enjoyable work. And this lay down some foundations now at the beginning of your career. You can maybe do this for your whole life.
Wow, talking about rats for my whole life. I can't wait.
As we said, our friend Jay Ingram, he's been doing this his whole life. We always make fun of him because he's retired like so many times, but he just doesn't stop. He just keeps doing it. He keeps writing books because he loves it. But that's, I think, all from us, folks. Thank you so much. If you have any questions throughout the week, you can contact us. You can hit us up on social media. You can hit us up on our website there. I'll put my personal email here in the chat as well if anyone wants to ask me a direct question outside of the workshop here. And yeah, anything else from the Science Unscientific Method, folks?
Go for it, Laura.
Well, thank you everyone for coming. We'll be sending out an email right after this with the Google Drive, and really excited to hear all your stories. I'm going to echo what Michael said. Have fun with it. It's supposed to be a really cool way to start thinking about how you can share your story with friends and family and the public. So we're excited to hear more about your science next week. And thanks to SciCats for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a great day.